Robb Stark's leadership is deeply rooted in a psychological inheritance shaped by honor, legacy, and expectation, all of which stem from his upbringing in a noble household that valued duty above personal desire. From the moment he is thrust into command following his father's execution, Robb does not merely assume political authority, but also inherits the emotional weight of representing a moral code in a morally fractured world. His leadership identity is therefore less self-constructed and more imposed, creating an internal tension between who he is and who he must appear to be for his followers. This tension manifests in his constant struggle between emotional authenticity and strategic necessity, as Robb consistently chooses actions aligned with personal integrity even when they undermine long-term political stability. Psychologically, this reveals a leader driven not by pragmatic calculation, but by moral congruence, meaning that his sense of self must align with his decisions or risk internal dissonance. In high-stakes environments, this trait becomes both his greatest strength and most fatal vulnerability. Robb's loyalty to family serves as a central axis of his leadership psychology, shaping his motivations and reinforcing his legitimacy among his bannermen. His rebellion is framed not as ambition but as justice, which allows him to inspire devotion through shared outrage rather than coercion. This emotional alignment between leader and followers creates cohesion, but also narrows strategic flexibility, as deviations from this moral narrative risk undermining the symbolic unity of his cause. His youth further complicates his leadership style, introducing an undercurrent of insecurity masked by decisiveness. Robb compensates for his lack of experience through boldness in battle, where clarity of action replaces ambiguity of thought. Warfare becomes the arena in which he can embody certainty, allowing tactical brilliance to substitute for political maturity. In interpersonal dynamics, Robb demonstrates a preference for relational trust over institutional control, often relying on personal bonds rather than structured authority. This reflects a leadership psychology grounded in feudal intimacy rather than bureaucratic distance. However, such dependence on loyalty makes him susceptible to betrayal when relationships fracture under competing pressures. His decision-making process frequently prioritizes ethical symbolism over utilitarian calculation, reinforcing his image as a just ruler while simultaneously constraining his strategic adaptability. This suggests an internalized belief that legitimacy must be continually proven through visible adherence to principle. In this way, leadership becomes performative morality. Robb's communication style also reveals an inclination toward emotional resonance rather than manipulative persuasion. He inspires through sincerity rather than rhetoric, which deepens commitment among followers but limits his ability to manage dissent subtly. Opposition is therefore experienced as personal rupture rather than procedural disagreement. The psychological weight of being perceived as a living extension of his father's legacy creates a silent pressure that shapes Robb's risk tolerance. He does not merely fear defeat, but moral failure, which carries a deeper existential threat. This leads him to avoid actions that could be interpreted as dishonorable even when strategically sound. Romantic attachment further complicates his identity, as his marriage decision illustrates the collision between personal desire and political obligation. By privileging emotional truth over alliance building, Robb unconsciously asserts autonomy against the structural expectations placed upon him. This act becomes a declaration of selfhood within a role that denies individuality. Ultimately, Robb's leadership is psychologically defined by an attempt to reconcile inherited ideals with lived reality, a process that produces both inspiration and fragility. His tragedy lies not in incompetence, but in coherence, as he remains consistent with his values even when the world demands contradiction. Robb Stark's effectiveness as a battlefield commander stems from an intuitive grasp of movement, timing, and deception, suggesting a cognitive style that thrives in dynamic environments. He demonstrates an ability to synthesize incomplete information rapidly, allowing him to outmaneuver more experienced opponents. This intuitive intelligence contrasts sharply with his comparative discomfort in prolonged political negotiation. His victories reinforce a feedback loop in which tactical success strengthens self-belief, encouraging reliance on instinct over consultation. This fosters decisiveness, but gradually reduces openness to alternative perspectives. As confidence grows, the psychological need for validation through consensus diminishes. Robb's leadership presence in battle is characterized by visibility and shared risk, which enhances group morale through identification. Soldiers perceive him not as a distant commander, but as a participant in their struggle. This embodied leadership style deepens loyalty, while intensifying the personal stakes of failure. Yet beneath this martial confidence lies an emotional sensitivity that complicates strategic ruthlessness. Robb experiences loss and injustice not as abstract costs, but as personal wounds, making it difficult for him to engage in morally ambiguous tactics. His empathy strengthens cohesion, but weakens deterrence. The psychological cost of leadership emerges in moments of solitude, where Robb confronts the isolation inherent in command. Responsibility becomes a silent burden that cannot be fully shared, leading to a narrowing of emotional expression. This isolation subtly shifts his reliance toward a smaller circle of trusted advisors. Trust itself becomes a defining psychological variable in his command style, as Robb consistently privileges perceived sincerity over calculated reliability. He interprets loyalty through emotional cues rather than structural guarantees. This approach fosters warmth, but exposes vulnerabilities in alliance management. His strategic imagination allows him to conceptualize victory through surprise and adaptability. Yet this same imagination struggles with the slower mechanics of governance. War offers clarity through objectives, while politics demands compromise without resolution. Robb's psyche gravitates toward the former. Conflict between short-term compassion and long-term necessity repeatedly shapes his decisions, illustrating a leadership psychology caught between protector and ruler. He seeks to minimize suffering even when severity might prevent greater loss later. This moral immediacy constrains strategic foresight. Moments of doubt are often concealed behind decisive action, reflecting a coping mechanism that equates hesitation with weakness. By acting swiftly, Robb maintains internal stability even when uncertainty persists. Action becomes a defense against introspection. In the end, Robb Stark's command reveals a leader whose greatest strength lies in authentic connection and instinctive brilliance, yet whose emotional depth complicates the harsh calculations required for survival. His leadership is not undone by lack of vision, but by an unwavering humanity that resists the compromises of power. Robb Stark's leadership ultimately becomes a study in the fragile architecture of trust, where loyalty functions not merely as a political currency, but as an emotional foundation upon which authority is built. His command depends less on fear or institutional enforcement, and more on shared belief in mutual obligation, creating a psychological contract between leader and follower. This reliance on interpersonal faith generates unity, but leaves his power structure vulnerable to hidden fractures. The feudal nature of his alliances reinforces the illusion that loyalty is stable, when in reality it is conditional and constantly renegotiated. Robb interprets allegiance through personal sincerity, assuming that those who swear oaths internalize them as moral commitments rather than strategic choices. This assumption reflects a projection of his own values onto others. As pressures mount, the divergence between symbolic loyalty and pragmatic interest becomes increasingly pronounced. Houses that once rallied behind him begin to calculate costs and benefits, revealing the transactional undercurrent beneath their devotion. Robb's inability to fully recognize this shift demonstrates a cognitive bias toward relational permanence. The psychological rupture begins when promises are broken, not merely as political missteps, but as violations of shared identity. When Robb chooses personal love over alliance obligation, he unknowingly destabilizes the moral symmetry that bound his followers. The breach signals that even the most principled leader may prioritize selfhood. This moment introduces ambiguity into his leadership narrative, weakening the clarity that previously inspired confidence. Followers who once saw him as the embodiment of justice now confront a more human, fallible figure. The shift from symbol to individual alters the emotional calculus of loyalty. Betrayal, when it emerges, is not sudden but cumulative, built upon layers of perceived inconsistency and unmet expectation. Each deviation from the collective script creates space for doubt to grow. Trust erodes quietly before it collapses dramatically. Robb's response to dissent remains rooted in moral disappointment rather than strategic recalibration. He experiences disloyalty as a personal wound rather than the predictable outcome of competing interests. This emotional framing limits his ability to respond with calculated containment. The atmosphere surrounding him gradually shifts from solidarity to guarded cooperation, where outward allegiance masks internal hesitation. This duality produces an environment in which betrayal can thrive undetected. Psychological cohesion gives way to silent fragmentation. In such conditions, authority becomes performative rather than secure, sustained by ritual rather than conviction. Robb continues to lead as though unity remains intact, unaware of the widening gap between appearance and reality. Leadership becomes an act of faith in a system already dissolving. Ultimately, the collapse of trust reveals the paradox at the heart of Robb's leadership. The very empathy and honor that inspired devotion also rendered him incapable of anticipating betrayal. His tragedy is not simply defeat, but the realization that loyalty, when rooted in emotion alone, can become the most unstable foundation of power.